Welcome, very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for coming to this seminar today, hosted by the Asian Law Centre in conjunction with the Australian Indian Institute. My name is Sarah Biddulph and I'm the Director of the Asian Law Centre, which is in Law School. So the Asian Law Centre welcomes you very much to this seminar by Professor Bindu Puri, who is Professor of Contemporary Indian Philosophy, the Centre of Philosophy, School of Social Sciences in JAWAHRLAL NEHRU University. So welcome you very much to our stage. First, let me acknowledge that this meeting today is being conducted on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and welcome any Indigenous people here, or anybody who is listening from wherever you are. So you'll see that the law school has with permission, installed a number of photographs and images of very important historical events. And so I think it's significant today that this talk is conducted in a room that recognises the important contributions that Indigenous people have made to all our lives over a long time. But now let me, without ado, turn to Lisa Singh, who's the Director of the Australia Indian Institute, or the CEO, sorry, of the Australia Institute, who will introduce Professor Puri to us and kick off this segment. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Biddulph. It gives me also pleasure to be here at the Asian Law Centre at Melbourne Law School at Melbourne University. So thank you so much to Professor Biddulph and the Asian Law Centre for hosting this special lecture seminar talk today. I also would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging in this very important year of Australia's referendum for the voice. As Professor Biddulph said, the Institute has been really pleased to have Professor Bindu Puri be here at the University of Melbourne for the past week as part of the Australian Institute's Visiting Fellows series, as she is one of the Institute's fellows, academic fellows, and it's wonderful to have her here as such a prominent scholar as she is on Gandhi, Tagore, and Vedka. But today we are going to be very in for a treat as she shares with us her alternative understanding of justice, according, from Gandhi. So to introduce Professor Puri, I want to share with you that she has a very extensive academic focus on contemporary Indian philosophy and political philosophy. Professor Puri has authored 3 monographs and 8 edited volumes and over 50 papers in edited anthologies and interdisciplinary journals. Her most recent work, Gandhi for the 21st Century, Religion, Morality and Politics, is currently in press with Springer Nature Publications. And she has a forthcoming book on Rabindranath Tagore, Peace in an Enchanted World, with Routledge, and we really look forward to that. As a prominent scholar, though, Professor Puri has presented over 160 papers and lectures at internationally and national forums, and as I mentioned, is one of our non-resident fellows at the Institute at the University of Melbourne. She serves on the editorial boards of prestigious international journals of philosophy like Sophia and Philosophia, and has delivered several prestigious lectures, including the annual M.K. Gandhi Lecture on Peace and the Humanities for the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council of Ottawa in Canada. So we are very honoured to have Professor Puri speak on Gandhi's alternative understanding of justice, a unilateral duty of deference, hosted, of course, here today by the Asian Law Centre and the Australian Institute at the University of Melbourne at the Law School. It's a great pleasure to introduce and please make welcome Professor Bindu Puri.
I'd like to thank Honorable Lisa Singh, for CEO of the Australia India Institute, for this wonderful introduction. And I would like to thank Professor Sarah Bidor, Director of the Asian Law Centre at the University of Melbourne, for making this afternoon possible. And like as been said, I'm looking at Gandhi's alternative conception of justice, the unilateral duty of deference, and it's surely natural that Gandhi should have been concerned about justice, given that he was seeking political, economic justice for colonized Indians. But in this lecture, I'm trying to argue that a concern for justice governs both the means and ends of his politics. And that's really what I'm going to talk about here. Any reconstruction of the ethics of Gandhi's politics as a concern for justice must begin by saying that the ethics of Gandhi's politics could not be different from the ethics of the properly human life for Gandhi, because Gandhi made no distinction between the sphere of the public and the private. And he rejected the distinction. Much has been said about Gandhi's integrity, the fact that all the different aspects of life were integrated together, and everything, aesthetics, economics, politics, flowed from these, the distinctively moral notions at the heart of his thinking. So Gandhi thought about the state and the relationship between citizens using metaphors of the kingdom of righteousness and, speaking about kinship, family feeling. The idea of ramrajya, which he often used as the ideal state. These things seem to be alternative to contemporary liberal, let's read this as Rawlsian, utilitarian conceptions of the ethics of the political. But, differences between liberal theories notwithstanding, and there are enormous differences, of course. Liberal conceptions of the right and of justice have been constructed around ideas of consent-based authority, centralized representative, parliamentary democracy, third-party justice, and equality before the law. And Gandhi, of course, has a very different take on justice. And I think many people may not be aware, but as early as 1909, when he wrote a little pamphlet about Hind Swaraj, or the freedom of India, he critiqued liberal concepts of justice. He seemed to have understood this term justice primarily in the sense of giving all human and non-human others their due. And this sense of justice as giving other people their due, respect, seems close enough to the ordinary sense of the term, because there's a sense in which justice demands that people get their due, even if we, the person getting the due or others, may not like a result. But Gandhi understood what was due to others primarily in terms of non-injury, ahimsa, as love, and deference, respect to all others, friendly or hostile, human or non-human. And here, the poet Rabindranath Tagore and Gandhi both thought that nature or non-human world deserves this deference as well. If you read Tagore's plays and novels, he puts it very well, because in some of the situations, you find the protagonist, the heroine or the hero, kind of taking comfort from nature, which is seen as a third, mediating the relationship between man and God. It's a beautiful sense. So Tagore literally lives in an enchanted garden. So to unpack this theory of justice, ahimsa, as deference and respect for otherness, I'm going to look a little bit about the Indian terms for justice in the classical tradition. So there are three terms which are there: dharma, dhamma combined, nyaya and niti. And the Indian tradition uses all these three terms in connection with justice. Amartya Sen has actually very nicely explained the difference between this nyaya and niti and I'm quoting him here, he says, look, these are two different aspects of justice in early Indian jurisprudence, niti and nyaya. The niti relates to organizational propriety as well as behavioral correctness, and nyaya is concerned with what emerges and how. And in particular, the lives that people are actually able to lead. The distinction helps us to see clearly that there are two different, though not unrelated kinds of aspects, which the idea of justice caters in the Indian tradition. And one might see that niti is analogous to institutional concerns, that which Rawls had famously spoken about when he said justice is the first virtue of social institutions. The second is concerned with a more practical concern, contextual concern. And you can understand this a little better with another combined, which had a very long history in the Indian religious, political, legal, literary, ethical domains, dharma or dhamma. And I would, dharma, dhamma was these terms which were used in both the Shramanic and the Brahmanic traditions. And these are a little complicated. I'll just come to them. I suggest that Gandhi understood justice in a combine of organizational propriety and individual duty of deference. And this was due, perhaps to his location in this tradition of Indian kind of way thinking about justice. And dharma and dhamma is also, a term which is analogous, let's say, to justice, but it subsumes the English concepts of religion, law, duty, right, justice, practice, and principle. So at the risk of putting it too simplistically, one might suggest that dharma dhamma in the Shramanic and Brahmanical traditions can be understood in terms of the demands of righteousness or justice in relation to one's context, in the process of living out one's life, one's role in life. So one quite sees how Gandhi was able to speak about justice in terms of ahimsa as a unilateral, one-sided. And that's a very important term here. So it's very far away from reciprocity in a Rawlsian sense. So now, liberal theories have been preoccupied with perhaps three central issues: liberty, equality, and distributions of benefits and burdens in society. And in his famous opening words in A Theory of Justice, Rawls said, justice is the first virtue of institutions. And it can be argued that, of course, there are enormous differences of context. Like I said, there is the utilitarian principle as the design of social institutions to promote the maximization of utility. Rawls' theory of justice is fairness. Nozick's libertarianism, capabilities approach, Dworkin, equality of resources doctrine. All these but share in emphasizing that justice regulates the basic structure of society, its patterns of distribution, and that it is based on consent-based state authority, rule of law, through third-party justice. It's interesting that Rawls argues that the sense of justice as applied to practices is the basic one, and justice as a virtue of particular actions or persons, and I'm quoting Rawls, would go quite easily once the basic structure of justice as applied to institutions had been understood. So it's indisputable that justice provides a framework to regulate the play of competing values and ends in society. In that sense, it's a virtue of institutions. And it has a sanction independently of the goals that men actually seek, human beings seek. Rawls locates that sanction in principles chosen by people in a hypothetical original situation. And Gandhi locates it in individual self-rule, freedom, which is self-restraint. It's quite clear that when Gandhi recommends that justice should be understood as an individual sense of deference or respect for others, he understood that what he was doing was recommending something which was much more exacting than tolerance of other people. And he said, and I'm just quoting him here, when he was responding, and this was all done in a context where, there was response to racial, religious, caste, otherness. And he said, look, I don't like the word tolerance. It implies a kind of gratuitous assumption of the inferiority of other points of view to one's own. So Gandhi's insight about the nature of justice seems to be based on a number of things, which I'm going to try to unpack here. The first thing is that of the nature of the human being, the innermost nature of the human being. Then a notion of freedom as swaraj, a notion of austerity, tapasya. All these go into making this kind of notion that he had of justice. On a Gandhian account, a human life which is properly lived would only be properly lived if human beings lived up to what he calls their kind of unilateral obligation or the special virtue of their series to respect other people. So I'm going to kind of look at this notion of swabhava or innermost nature in this little subsection over here. Now, he says that, human beings have this special virtue as a species of owning up to kinship with the most distant other. And this is a unilateral, one-sided obligation to recognize otherness as kith and kin, which actually, when unpacked, means that you're going to defer equally to the points of view of hostile others as you would to your own point of view. And this is really his basic sense of doing justice to other people. Now, he therefore thought of the state as organized in concentric circles, going out from the individual to the outermost circle, and local organizations, the stress of the local. The day he died in the morning, he wrote an alternative constitution for India, which said India should have been built in concentric circles around the local. Why did he do that? Because he felt that local organization would make it possible for individuals to be made responsible for the practice of an absolute equality of deference or respect to others. And that led him to kind of emphasize what has famously been called the oceanic model of state. And here at the heart was what he called the Panchayati Raj, which was a council of village elders who would kind of solve things right in the context. Amartya Sen, of course, works on this quite a bit, and he points out how an institution-centric concept of justice does miss out something. And therefore we can, this he does in the context of looking at the alternative Ambedkarian approach to justice. So Gandhi's emphasis on the fact that justice should be essentially contextual comes from thinking of justice differently without a measure as emerging from the irreducible particular experience of giving the different oppressing other their due in a particular context. And this rested upon the argument that having a sense of justice is the special virtue of a human life. And he spoke often of this innermost nature of the human being. Very interestingly, he ran this journal called Indian Opinion. In 1926, there were 2 pieces which he wrote about human nature. He said, look, it is human nature. The word natural or nature is very abused. Not everything that is natural to the brute is natural to man. It must be man's nature to know and find God. But this God seeking is not temples and churches and mosques. This God seeking is about truth, because he says in the 1920s that truth is God and God is truth, and the best name for God is truth. So he says that if it is man's nature to know and find God, what does it mean? The duty is to kind of develop your God-word faculties to perfection. And this means human nature is non-injury rather than violence. And through this nature, the human being evolves, and I'm quoting him, the ethics of subduing desire, anger, ignorance, and other passions. And he thought, he kind of invoked this God or truth as a way to think about the human being, often spoke about the human being as a silhouette, an image, of God. And like I said, God was truth. Now, it's interesting that in the same time, a doctor wrote on this essay in the Indian Opinion. It's really very interesting about Gandhi, that he really welcomed criticism. And he was often writing to those who critiqued him. Why haven't you sent your critique? I'm waiting for it. I'll get it published. And he would say to people that I think those who criticize me are like lighthouses. They point out so many different things where I may go wrong. So that was actually a practical nonviolence. And this is how his nonviolence played out. So in the doctor in 1921 said that, what is this? To prevent violence is against human nature. Human beings by nature are violent. And Gandhi responded that one is taught to believe that a species is recognized by their special characteristics. So I think it's wrong to presume that a horse is an animal first and a horse later. The horse is an animal because he's a horse. So man is human because he's ahimsa or non-violent. That's the idea. And this ahimsa, which rules humanity, involved, and this is a wonderful metaphor Gandhi uses, the idea that the human being's non-violence means the human has to own kinship, not only with the lion and the leopard, but the snake and the scorpion. And this is unilateral obligation, ek pakshi farj, imposed on the human, because the human is the image or the silhouette of the divine. Now, obviously, this is a metaphor because he's really scared of snakes and scorpions, particularly in the settlements where he lives. But the idea is that otherness is scary, and you got to think of it as your own person. So he also used this notion of obligation, duty many times in connection with justice. Very few people know that in 1948, the framers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights wrote to Gandhi to respond about this. And he actually was very uncomfortable with the sense of rights of men without duty. He thought that if everybody, just presses for rights, who's going to do the duties and give people rights, he felt. So he said an individual can earn rights by performing this basic human duty. What is this human duty? Of being non-injurious to others and of deferring equally to others. And I'm just going to quote what he said about this non-violence. It is the largest love, the greatest charity. If I am a follower of ahimsa, I must love my wrongdoing enemy. I must apply the same rules to somebody I consider an enemy or someone who seems a stranger to me, as I would to my wrongdoing father or son. And this is really on which the satyagraha or the non-violent protest as a means to earn justice. This is really what it was based upon, that you would treat the person from whom you sought redressal of injustice as if it was a member of your own family. And even while undergoing the protest, you would maintain an equal deference to the person and the belief of the other as you had for yourself. And how would you do that? Then what would be the protest like? The protest would be a choice between inflicting pain on the other and inflicting some kind of austerity, voluntary pain on yourself. And as everybody famously knows, he went in for a large number of fasts and so on, thereby seeking rights by the voluntary acceptance of pain on himself, which was a form of austerity on which this whole principle satyagraha, this method to redress injustice, was based. Satya agraha basically means non-violent firmness on truth. So this was like the only way available once you decide that justice requires you to have a unilateral obligation to respect the otherness of the other. So that was the only way. So now moving on to another concept that Gandhi used in connection with injustice and justice. This was the idea of ramrajya as a kind of kingdom of righteousness. This was not, as it seems, a metaphor for Hindu majoritarian rule, but for the state, which would ensure perfect justice to the minor. And you see, for him, he spoke of something which was called complete freedom, which in Gujarati was Purna Swaraj. And by this, he said, it's this what I am trying or what I'm working towards is complete because it's as much for the prince as for the peasant, as much for the landowner as for the landless tiller of soil, as much for the Hindu as for the Muslim, as much for the Parsi and Christian as for the Jains, Jews, and Sikhs, irrespective of creed or status. He also emphasized that the ideal state would be one where justice could be easily secured to the minor. And he said, look, the meaner citizen should be secured of swift justice, shouldn't have a long process to go. So Gandhi was quite clear that though the aim of the national movement was to establish such an ideal state as a state of perfect justice, such an ideal state could not justify, such an end could not justify the use of unjust means like violence or righteous war to achieve it. No matter if the goal sought is political self-government, social equality, economic justice, equality of resources, an assertion of individual or group rights can only proceed by deferring to otherness. And so the means had to be this respecting equally the person and beliefs of other people. Now, what about this freedom that he's moving towards? It's called Swaraj. In 1909, he writes this booklet where he begins by saying, freedom is actually to be understood in two senses. One is political self-government and the other is self-rule. And he's interested in the simultaneous freedom of all people as equality. And but his idea of equality is not abstract. It involves the individual's practice of equality as this equality of respect. And this practice puts constraints on individual freedom. So it kind of freedom gets transformed and equality gets transformed. And so you see, self-rule is a state of being, a form of personhood, where the human being is in control of his own or her own baser impulses or passion-driven impulses, which according to Gandhi might lead to a violent attitude towards others. So, of course, but at the same time, freedom is also about political liberty. And you should see that in 1931, in conjunction with Nehru, Gandhi had framed this resolution called on economic rights and fundamental rights at the Indian National Congress, and the preamble stated that one of the chief aims was to enable the masses to understand what freedom would mean. And this list in 1931 was fundamental rights of the people, and I'm quoting from that resolution: freedom of association and combination, freedom of speech and press, freedom of conscience, and free profession and practice of religion, subject to public order and morality, protection of culture, scripts, language of minorities, adult suffrage, free primary education, rights, living wage for industrial workers, limited hours of labor, healthy conditions of work, and many others. So this was framed in 1931. He was very clear about political freedom. However, he thought political freedom as the simultaneous freedom of the major and the minor rights was not sufficient. Otherness would not be overcome only by rights, but by this practice of equality. And this was the spirit of his talisman. It's a very beautiful thought that he has. He says, I'm giving you a talisman, a test. Whenever you're about to do something, think of the face of the poorest person you know, and think whether what you're going to do is going to make any difference to him. And that's really his test. He says, will that action lead to swaraj of freedom for the hungry and spiritually starving? So that was his test. So it's concerns of justice that led him to this dual understanding of freedom. He thought self-rule as self-control and the consequent human capacity to think about what is owed to others is really the best way to ensure that you are able to do justice to other people. And he said, look, you can't have political freedom without self-rule. Real home rule rests on this self-rule. So Gandhi was very clear that the stability of justice in society depends on the internal strength of the individual to fight against the heaviest odds and, sort of to defer to other people. So he said true democracy or swaraj of the masses can never come through violent means. The natural corollary to their use would be to remove all opposition through the suppression of antagonists. That does not mean make for individual freedom. Individual freedom can have the fullest play only under the regime of unadulterated non-violence. So Gandhi invokes the issue of individual freedom and its relationship to authority. His view, there is this, continuous need for the individual to develop a form of personhood that empowers the citizen to exercise his or her natural sense of justice, and that this would be a method of regulating state authority and its exercise of arbitrary power. And what was this method? It was the capacity by all to resist authority when it was abused. And in 1907, he read Thoreau, and he wrote about Thoreau in his journal, and this duty to fill prisons if a law is found to be unjust. This was something that he practiced. So the sense of justice as constituting the innermost orientation of the human being influenced Gandhi's conception of freedom as political self-government, but this is contingent upon individual self-rule or self-control. And this is really what he thought was freedom. This meant that he was equally concerned with the simultaneous freedom of the major and the minor in Indian society, as he was the freedom of the oppressive colonizer. He said, if I want freedom for my country, I can't destroy the freedom of other people. I must respect that freedom too. His methodology, of course, was meant to contest domination without seeking to set up another dominating center or another major. So Gandhi was interested in self-rule as a freedom for the individual from his or her own need to dominate or exercise arbitrary power. So that's really self-rule. So he said, look, men aspiring to be free can hardly think of enslaving others. If they enslave others, they will be binding their own chains of slavery. So tighter. The freedom from the need to dominate the other. The freedom from the subjection to domination by another. That's really what this method, satyagraha, was about. And freedom as home rule was a freedom from economic, political, social domination by the other. As self-rule, it was the freedom from the need to dominate the other. So this is really for Gandhi natural to man. This was his swabhava or her swabhava, the innermost nature of the human being. And now I'll move to the next section, which is on tapas, this way that he made this satyagraha happen. This was basically, there's an ancient Indian concept of tapas, austerity. Tapa, which means to burn, heat, which comes with the idea that there is this voluntary acceptance of pain, and this gives miraculous, this worldly powers. What are these powers? The powers to transform first yourself and other people in a view to dissipate or get over conflicts. So this was the idea of tapas as the base of satyagraha as a method of securing justice. This idea of Gandhi using tapasya was first actually brought to the notice of people by Rabindranath Tagore, who was a poet from Bengal and a world traveler. He had done more trips around the world than any of us right now. And he had this debate, famous debate with Gandhi, for actually 26 years, over the pages of the national newspapers, criticizing him. And yet they were the best of friends. And Gandhi actually, in the Harijan of June 10th, 1933, carried an editorial on the significance of Gandhi's third fast against the evil of untouchability. And he referred to Gandhi as the great tapas, this great man who had courted death with the determination of equalizing the high and the low. So this tapasya was, of course, an age-old concept, not something that Gandhi invented, but just like with everything else, he adapted it and tried to, it performed two related functions in his ethics. For one, it kind of changed from abstract general responsibility into individual responsibility. An individual assumed responsibility for the action of him or herself, and also for his or her implication in the action of the collective self, of which he or she might have been a part. And secondly, it was a resource to effect the transformation of the self and the other by intensifying the passive resistance of the protester. And this made it possible for the subject to secure justice from the other without doing injustice to him or her. So with the invocation of tapasya, the ethics of Gandhi's politics brought home powerfully the lesson of individual rather than general responsibility. Now, just to bring all this together with a few alternative kind of points, how did Gandhi then think about justice? One, he explained the special weight of considerations of justice in terms of the natural human sense of a unilateral obligation of owning kinship to otherness. But this goes against a familiar way of thinking about justice. This way, which goes back at least to the Greek sophists, regards the acceptance of principles of justice as a compromise between people of roughly equal power who would enforce their wills on others if only they could do so. On such accounts, the parties concerned do not employ force only because prudence compels them to keep in view the equality of forces between them. In Rawls' account, of course, it differs significantly from this way, the concept of justice is located still in conditions of reciprocity between rational and mutually self-interested parties. But Gandhi's idea of this one-sided obligation, this unconditional moment, setting the circle like, otherwise it would just go around in a circle, reciprocity. The second thing is that he rejects the adequacy of liberal institutions which secure justice for the basic structure. He thinks that this is not always able to secure justice to the minor, and therefore there has to be a more contextual approach, nearer to the local. And here I'll quote him from the Hind Swaraj. It's wrong to consider that courts are established for the benefit of the people. Surely the decision of a third party is not always right. The parties alone know who is right. We in our simplicity and ignorance imagine that a stranger, by taking our money, gives us justice. So the only mediation that he would accept would be somewhere near the local, at the local level. The third issue, let's say, point in his alternative concept is that questions of justice were involved with questions of truth. And you know, in liberal concepts, very many people have pointed out, truth is kind of on a side, it's kind of bracketed out. But for him, truth was very important. And the equality of deference to the other was based on the possibility that truth could also lie in the position and the beliefs of the opposing other. And Gandhi was always ready to do that. So his opponents found it very, very difficult to deal with him because he was like incredibly polite and courteous and full of love and wanting to know their point of view. So it was hard to be angry with him or against him. And there was this idea that justice is concerned with truth and should be contextual. The next point was there was an inseparable relation between the means and the end. And this intimate relationship meant that justice could never be secured without giving others their due. So the love, what he called the law of love or the force of truth, was to be brought into the arena of the conflicting relationships between citizens in the political sphere, and satyagraha became the only appropriate means to redress injustice. Fifthly, and you know, he did these satyagrahas were used to redress injustice in vastly different contexts. So it happened in South Africa, Then it happened in Champaran with the indigo laborers, and he kind of went there to solve that redressal of injustice issue in Bihar, stayed there for a long time. Then it happened with the mill workers. So it wasn't that he did it in a vast scale for the freedom of India for the first time. It was being done slowly and in small ways. The last insight here, that the Gandhian Satyagrahas, his conception of justice, shared the liberal concern with the freedom of the individual and the nation, but he thought of this freedom differently. And this word, swaraj, I think is very interesting because, I sometimes see people making syllabi or setting things in place in curriculum in India and saying, look, we are going to adopt an issue-based approach. But they don't see that the issues that we kind of put out are mostly kind of framed from the Euro-Anglo-American tradition and text. So what you really have to do is to read all these texts anew and frame the concepts, arguments, issues from this perspective as well. Not that we need to do this as a kind of form of assertion of identity, but it just makes the world a richer place to have different approaches and to unpack these different ways of doing and thinking about things. So Swaraj is like a different way of thinking about freedom. It's political self-government and individual self-control. He's philosophically alive to this simultaneous freedom of all as equality, but he thinks you must practice equality. And that's really very important to him. So just to conclude, the ownmost nature of the human being, the sense of deference to the otherness of the other, the voluntary acceptance of pain, rather than the infliction of pain on the other to resolve conflicts about justice. These were the signifying marks of a Gandhian conception of justice. And Gandhi, in this context, called for tapas, voluntary acceptance of pain, as a means to transform oneself and the other. Very important to see, Gandhi was not patronizing. He was not saying, I'm going to transform the other. It was about transforming yourself first, seeing where are you going wrong. And so that was very important. A sense of justice as a function of the relationship of an equality of deference between individuals was the first virtue in Gandhi, and it constituted the ethics of his politics. So with that, I thank you for your patience and come to the end of this alternative Gandhian conception of that.
Thank you, Professor Puri. I noticed that we have 10 minutes left in this session. Are you happy to receive questions? So I'll throw the floor open to questions. When you ask your question, would you please identify yourself first and then address your question to Professor Puri? So, yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Elaine. I'm a postdoc fellow at the Melbourne Law School, and your talk is fascinating. I'm really intrigued by this topic. It just reminds me instantly of Levinas Emile, a French philosopher who is also focusing on this one-directional otherness. While what differs from Levinas is Gandhi has more political aspiration. And my question is, does Gandhi's core has a material, sort of it does materialize in India's political discourse and public discourse and even juridical discourse, or even beyond, like beyond the Indian discourse, in your observations?
Wonderful. That's a very nice question. I actually now say that Gandhi belongs less to India. He's a transnational global Gandhi. He holds out a home to human beings anywhere. And you see how much influence he had in the civil rights movements in the USA, on Martin Luther King. In 1936, in Gujarat, in Bardoli, Reverend Howard Thurman, I think he was, who came to meet him there. And there were large number, Dubois, I think he was a Jamaican, large number of figures at that time were in touch with him and influenced by Gandhian methods. More recently, there's Václav Havel, there's Aung San Suu Kyi. There are a large number of people across the world who have adopted this method of protest. So I do think it's a global kind of movement. Also, it's a hope that yes, we can solve conflicts without violence.
Yes, I wonder, could I invite you
Yeah,
to come
yeah.
back? Because the video is here.
Yeah.
Yes, and you don't want them videoing me, then they can videoing you. Thank you. Now, are there any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for that beautifully inspiring talk. My name is Sadhna Jithu. I'm a local lawyer, born in South Africa, and my family have lived alongside the Gandhi family for many decades. Gandhiji's granddaughter, Ila Gandhi, and mum were schoolgirls together. And the Gandhian values have been a very important influence, not only in our lives, but in the resolution of conflict in South Africa. Nelson Mandela said that in the 21st century and beyond, the Gandhian method of resolving conflict will become increasingly more important. The alternative is nuclear destruction, mutually assured destruction. So you needn't convince me of the universal nature of Gandhiji's principles. We've seen it at work. There is one thing that still disturbs me, and if I could have one conversation with Gandhiji, this is what I would ask him. Is there anything more he could say about the concept of human rights to show how it comes into its own when the duties are in fact ignored? Because everything else about Gandhian philosophy, the notion of not cooperating with an assault on one's dignity, but simply using truth force to stand up for the truth is a passive call for your dignity, for one's dignity to be respected, and standing up to the oppressor and allowing them to do their worst so that they demonstrate to themselves that the brutish way of resolving matters is not where we want to be as noble human beings. So everything about Gandhian philosophy reinforces the notion of human rights, but for his express statements that he would prefer people to focus on self-discipline, self-purification, and their duties. So I wonder if you could help me in the absence of Gandhiji coming back to clarify this for us.
No, but it's very interesting. You know, he originally defines satyagraha as a method of securing rights. Satyagraha was a method of earning rights. But how would you earn the rights? By taking suffering in yourself rather than making others suffer. So from 1906, it was a method of securing rights. And he secured rights. The point that he was trying to make was that you know what you said, self-purification, it's like actually got a history in the Indian tradition. Because the idea was that, I think for Gandhiji, that if you were not self-ruled, you wouldn't really enjoy your rights either. So if you would be someone who was given into all kinds of extremities of emotions, flinging yourself here and there emotionally, you just wouldn't have any rights actually. So you need to, in that sense, and that part I think was heavily influenced by the 19 verses about the self-controlled man of the Bhagavad Gita. So he had that idea that you need to be yourself in a form of personhood to be able to enjoy it. And the second aspect was that you need to earn rights. There's no unconditional right. And how do you earn these human rights? By doing the minimal duty of respecting the physical integrity and truth untruth of the other. That's the way that you earn your rights. So that's really what I have to say. But I think you spoke so beautifully about the Gandhian values and South Africa. So it just came alive to me for like 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for clarifying that Gandhi is for rights.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more, and Pradeep had his hand up. So if you keep it short so we can finish on time.
Okay, I'm Pradeep Taneja from the School of Social and Political Sciences in Australia, India Institute. I have to add that. Just wondering, listening to you, I mean, I'm not an expert on Gandhi, neither a philosopher nor a lawyer, but when I think of, other people writing about justice, there is often associated with justice is punishment or retribution. But listening to you, it appears to me that perhaps in Gandhi's philosophy or Gandhi's sort of definition of justice, there is no room for retribution. Would that be a correct understanding?
Yes, there's no room for retribution, and he had this absolute faith in human goodness of the other. So there was remedying remedial justice, but there was no room for punishment. For him, actually, it's very interesting you asked this, because he thought that, it is tapasya, this voluntary acceptance of pain, which is really the, most apt punishment for someone else. So when in his ashram, there would be some kind of wrong behavior on the part of anyone, he would go for a 21-day fast. And he would say this has two purposes. One, it makes me free of anger against them. And two, it makes them see how badly this has affected me and everybody else. And they are going to stop doing this now. So, this was his concept of a punishment to other people.
So, Professor Puri, unfortunately, we've reached our time.
Yeah.
And so on behalf of everyone, let me thank you very much indeed. It was a fabulous talk, really thought-provoking, and helping us to think our way through
Thank you so
things that
much.
we might not have actually thought through very well before. So thank you for coming, and
And
thank you for your
so much for
yeah.